afternoon, and welcome to IMA's Inside Talk webinar series. The title of today's presentation is Top 5 Success Factors in Implementing a New ERP System, sponsored by Oracle NetSuite. I'm Margaret Lockery, and I'll be your host for today's Inside Talk webinar. It's a pleasure to have Adam Larson as part of our program, and he will be serving as moderator for today's event. Adam is the Senior Manager of Educational Technology Enablement at IMA. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Margaret. I'm pleased to be a part of the IMA webinar series, and on behalf of IMA, I just want to welcome everyone to today's session. At this time, I'd like to introduce our feature presenter for today. Today we have Charles Thevenet. Charles has over 10 years of experience in implementing various ERP solutions as a consultant with Accenture, Oracle, and now Folio 3, a NetSuite Alliance partner. His customers and projects have ranged from 5-person companies to multi-international corporations in services, retail, wholesale distribution, manufacturing, and government. Charles now uses this experience at Folio 3 to build implementation, scoping documents, and solution architecture for ERP customers. Please join me in welcoming Charles Thevenet. So before turning the presentation over to our speaker, I'd like to go over some learning objectives for today's program. After participating in this webinar, you will recognize the key success factors for ERP implementation when selecting a new ERP solution and implementation partner. You'll also be able to identify the risks associated with an ERP implementation and the tools that can be used to mitigate them. And finally, you'll be able to discuss how to build a case for implementing a new ERP solution within your organization, including creating a plan, strategy to support the project. So we're looking to an informative presentation. But before I turn things over to Charles, we are going to have our first poll question. So we'd like your first poll question should be open on your screen. We'd like to remind you participants you have about 30 seconds to respond to each polling question today. And you may begin responding to the question as soon as it appears on your screen. So here's our first polling question. What is the primary risk factor for an ERP implementation? A rush discovery phase, poor planning, legacy data conversion, change management? Please note after selecting an answer, you may click the Submit button, which is located on the right side of your screen, just below the response options to make sure your answer is successfully recorded. So Charles, I'm going to turn things back over to you, and it looks like we're seeing what people think, and I'm sure you're going to cover the answer to this question.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, that's actually poor planning is definitely the one I was thinking of. I think the other ones are risk also, of course, which we're going to discuss, but definitely poor planning. I think as in anything, any type of project, you definitely want to prepare, and poor planning will have great consequences on the ERP implementation. So that definitely makes sense. So not surprised by this answer for poll number 1. So yeah, that's great. So we can now start. I'll just start off by telling you a little bit about myself. So I have been in ERP implementation for over 10 years now. I started back with Accenture and discovered the world of ERP through the implementation of SAP, which you may or may not have heard of. It's a very classic ERP system with implementations that typically last in terms of years with a lot of consultants. And then about 5 years ago, I discovered NetSuite, and now I work for Folio 3 as the head of customer success, and I do a mix of sales and then actual delivery as a consultant on our NetSuite ERP implementations. And Folio 3, we've been around since 2005. We're a full-service digital transformation agency with a mix of offshore and onshore resources and specialize in e-commerce, NetSuite implementation, and Microsoft Dynamics implementation. So that's a little bit on my background, and now we'll get into the presentation. So step 1, I would say the first factor that we're going to look at, and that's really tied to that question for the first poll, is preparation. How am I going to best prepare for an ERP implementation? And I think what's interesting is to look at it from both sides. The side of the customer will say, the company that's implementing the ERP, but also all the different partners that will be involved in this ERP implementation, and that would be typically the software vendor, but also the implementation partner, and there can be, different implementation partners that may specialize in different aspects of the ERP project. So I think it's important to keep in mind that preparation is for all the stakeholders within the project and not just the company purchasing the ERP. So number one is, of course, what am I even implementing in terms of platform? So you can find a lot of articles that will say, okay, what are you looking for? I think the main ones that I see when we're on opportunities seeing the competition for an ERP is there's going to be a difference between the very general ERP systems with full accounting, logistics, purchasing, sales, etc., and then more boutique ERPs that are really focused on a niche market, such as, would say, very advanced manufacturing or configured products. So I think when companies are choosing an ERP, they're going to look at, and you see that as the first selection criteria as functionality. Am I looking for general functionality that I can build on top of, or am I looking for very specialized functionality that's exactly what I need for my business, but then that might be more difficult to scale over time? So that's the big difference that I see, especially pitching, for instance, NetSuite versus more boutique products. Software costs, that's important. That'd be more, I would say, the license. I believe most license nowadays is subscription-based, especially with the cloud model, with payments that are done over time on that subscription model, so the infamous software as a service. So that's what you may hear for software cost. Implementation costs, that's a very important one. Of course, being from a consulting company, that's what we sell, the services for the implementation. So there's typically a ratio between the software price and the implementation cost, but you want to have a good handle on that cost because software cost is pretty predictable unless, you miss the module or something like that. But implementation cost, that's where you might have something like scope creep. Timeline, the question is, how long is this going to take to implement? So you definitely want to think about that when you're looking at the ERP solutions that could be a fit for your company. Is this going to be a question of several months, or is this going to take over a year, and what's the associated risk? So preparation is definitely the number one factor. And in terms, I started describing some of the risks tied to preparation, and of course want to offer some ideas on how to mitigate the risk around preparation. So one of the tools that we see on a lot of these opportunities is the use by the company of a selection firm. So that can be a consulting firm or a specialized selection firm, really specialized on ERP selection. And they will provide advisory services that are going to help you build out your requirements document and figure out, what you're even looking for before talking to different vendors and going through different scripts and demos and presentations. So you could use a selection firm. You could also use a consulting firm, just general consulting firm that actually knows the product already, and have a phase one discovery project. And the goal of that project would be to map out the different processes in the company to say, okay, today it looks like this. In the future, it may look like this with the new system. What are things that we may change in terms of business process with the new system? And what are things that need to stay the same and that the platform needs to support? So once you've done that, so it typically looks like a lot of flowcharts and Visio files. or just some documentation, a report on the business processes. Once you've defined that and that everyone agrees that that is the current picture or the picture of what the company wants to be, then you would run what we call a gap analysis, that is taking a look at what the target solution should be as defined in that process mapping document and seeing what the platform offers. And by doing that, you'll find gaps. And a gap is basically saying this process that you're trying to do in the target solution, that is not supported by the platform. And therefore, we need to figure out a way to customize the platform to support that process, or we define that that gap is a nice to have, not required, at least for a phase 1 go live, and that we can do without. So I think that's very important. Scoping customizations, having an idea of how much it's going to cost, the level of complexity, the level of risk for each customization that is generated from a gap. Data migration, you definitely want to think about that early, in the sense that you want to look at the data that is in your legacy systems and see the quality of the data, and also have an idea of the effort that's going to be tied in what we call the ETL process. So ETL would be extract, transform, load. So extracting is pulling the data out of existing systems. So I've had customers, for instance, that were, very old systems, and they didn't even know how to extract the data from their current system. So that can be a challenge. Transform is maybe the formats in that data are not appropriate, or there's some older obsolete data that needs to be filtered out. There needs to be a data cleanup. So that's for the transform piece. And then the loading part, that's formatting this legacy data into a template that can be absorbed by the new platform. And then that may seem more straightforward than the other ones, but actually there's more an aspect of performance in loading this data, as if there is a large volume that can take a lot of time and processing. And so you definitely want to have a sense of the volume and schedule the processing out. So all of that done in this preparation phase, all of those will be assets for a successful ERP implementation. The last risk mitigation factor that I put is managing expectations. So say managing expectations, that's on all sides. That's both for internal within the company that's implementing, that's going to have the new ERP, but also with the different partners involved in saying, this implementation, it's not necessarily going to be right away very smooth. There might be some headaches. There might be some functionality that you don't have right away. But I think it's very important to be realistic when planning out an ERP implementation and setting these expectations realistically. So that's for that. And then this is basically showing just, classic request for information, RFI process, where I'm going to, once I define my requirements, I'm going to send out a request for information and then have a review of the different responses for that RFI. And then, of course, at the end, I've seen my different vendors. They did their demos. They sent me all their collateral, their sales collateral, and I asked all my questions, got answers, and then I can select which platform I'm going to go with. And of course, I want to negotiate the price to try to get a discount on license, for instance. And yeah, that's a very simple version of it, but just to show the general timeline. So now I think we have the next poll question.
We do, Charles, thanks. As you all know, you may begin responding to the poll question immediately, and you have about 30 seconds to respond to each question. So here's our second question. Who is the key team to lead a successful ERP project? The customer team, the implementation partners functional team, the implementation partners developers, or the software provider? After choosing an answer, don't forget to click the Submit button located below the response option so it may record your answer. So Charles, I'm going to turn things back over to you so we can see how the audience responded.
Yep. So, implementation partners, functional team, number one. So yeah, I see it's pretty close between the two. And I mean, that is telling because it is really the two working together. I would definitely answer B also. I mean, obviously being in a service company, that is our role. But yeah, there definitely needs to be a very strong collaboration between the customer team and the implementation partner. I would say the implementation partner still has to be number one in the sense that they are getting paid for their expertise and they should have a wealth of experience and a number of references that make them, you know, the key responsible stakeholder for the implementation, for at least driving it and guiding the customer to successful implementation. So next factor for the success is building a team. Okay, so I selected a software platform. I'm very excited by the platform, but then the question is, who is actually going to implement it? How are we going to organize ourselves to set this project up? So we need resources. So you want to select the appropriate team. And the appropriate team starts by leadership. You definitely want, you know, what you would call a project sponsor. So that's typically at, you know, C-level, director, VP, controller, head of operations, that type of role. Even if they're not going to be the ones necessarily in the system directly at first, or the ones that will be looking at the configuration or running, you know, the basic testing, that's very important to have that level of leadership, to have an escalation point as needed. The next level is, I would say, just general stakeholders. So that can be anyone in the company that will be impacted by the implementation of the ERP, whether or not they're actually using the ERP themselves. That means it could be a department that's not going to use the ERP, but they will still be working with other teams that will. So if there's an issue with the ERP, then that will impact them also. So I think it's very important to define all the stakeholders and to have a sense of ownership for the project to make sure that everyone is on board. Everyone may not be on board with the same level of enthusiasm or the same things to win from the project. Actually, you might have a department that you know, is not happy about the change because they prefer their own home-built solution. But I think overall, you definitely need to have that consensus and make sure that the key stakeholders are on board. Super users, when I say super users, those will really be that team of business owners. You would also see the term subject matter expert that know their business, that know their processes, that know their department, know the people in the department, that can kind of share their experience implementing the ERP with them. And those are the people that you are going to run the actual ERP implementation with. Those are the people that are going to give you feedback on the configuration, let you know how the business works, fine-tune the different processes, workflows, reports, all the different elements of the ERP. Of course, the selection of the implementation partner is very important. What you're going to want to look at is expertise. I mean, number one, do they know the platform that I selected? Because you could have consulting firms that, you know, they see a technology that's going very well, so just take a generic consultant and say, well, you know, now you're a NetSuite expert, maybe if you never did NetSuite. So that's something to be careful with, is make sure the implementation partner has that expertise, which is typically given through references and just, you know, their general website, how much they're showing their expertise for a given platform versus another one. Availability is a big one, especially for platforms that are having a lot of traction on the market. You want to make sure that the implementation partner has the adequate number of resources and available resources to run the project, and that they're not taking more that they can deliver and not overcommitting. So that's definitely something you want to be careful with. Cost and contract type, that's the big one. So I, for instance, build the statement of work for our NetSuite implementation, which are usually fixed bids. So that's kind of the classic saying that, okay, we will deliver this ERP implementation for X amount. It's going to take about this much time, but really on a fixed bid contract, the partner is committing to what he's delivering. If it takes a little longer than what he expected, then that's on him. So that's the difference with the other version, which is a time and material, where you would have pre-negotiated hourly rates with the partner, and then they would bill you for each hour of the experts that they're using for the implementation. Then you might have different rates based on the level of expertise. I have a senior consultant, I have a junior consultant, I have a project manager. Are they offshore? Are they onshore? So those are important aspects for the cost. We do another version that's not quite fixed bid and not quite time and material. It's called team-based, where we actually say we will provide you 50% of this resources time, whether it's a functional consultant or a developer, and he will help you with your project. So we're just committing to a percent of allocation. You don't get billed more, you don't get billed less. So that's also a good approach. In terms of risk mitigation for building a team, you definitely want that leadership engagement to make sure that when the traction for the project is coming from the C-level, and that they can send a good message to the rest of the team saying, okay, how critical this ERP implementation is to the company, and keep that momentum. In terms of mitigating costs, our solution to that, for instance, at Folio 3, but you see that in a lot of service companies, is having a hybrid delivery between offshore and onshore resources. So various countries that do offshore delivery, but of course, usually they have a cheaper rates, so that allows partners to come in at a more competitive budget. And then with the current technology, it is very convenient just to work, in distributed fashion and having collaboration between offshore and onshore resources. On-site visits, I come from the world of Accenture with 80% travel, the Monday to Thursday for a huge consulting group. I think that's the classic model. What we see now is more targeted on-site visits. So great time for a implementation partner to visit a customer would be for a kickoff, so that the customer puts a face to name, that you're starting to build that relationship, and also, to be introduced to, their actual physical location. It could be a factory, a warehouse, a service department, and get a sense of the reality of what that company is doing. And then, of course, the last one, remote distributed resource, that's kind of tied to the offshore delivery. It's just more in general, even U.S.-based resources, it is cost-effective to have them work remotely and not be on-site all the time. You want to keep the on-sites for other critical times, such as prepping for user acceptance testing, that is making sure that everyone's good to go with the system, that they're in the system, testing, ready for go live. And then also a good time to come on site is either during cutover, when you're actually going live with the new system, or also I like to do post go live support, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after going live, to get some feedback from the customer, making sure they're happy with the system, fine-tuning the configuration, adding functionality as needed on the fly. But those on-sites I'm describing typically take 2 full business days. So, weekly on-sites may be overkill, especially with smaller companies where they have less bandwidth and they have to do their day job on top of, running this ERP project. The next slide is something that I built internally, and we are heavy on offshore delivery just because we think it's a great model and have a very strong offshore team. What this shows is you have the level of complexity here. The difference, the ones up high are complex on the more complex side, and the ones lower are simple, more standardized. And the question is, how do I split if I'm doing a hybrid delivery between offshore and onshore resources? How am I going to split the different tasks? I think this is actually a good slide just in general to see the different components at a more granular level of the ERP implementation. So as you can see, for offshore, most effective offshore and standardized, you'd have something like data migration. I can easily, send files to load to offshore. They can figure it out. That's something that's not necessarily with a high added value. Standard configuration, if you have a great offshore team and they know the platform very well, there's a lot that they can just do on their own offline, maybe with some guidance from the customer or the onshore resource, but most of the heavy lifting for configuration can be done by them. Development, connector work, all of the technical developments, that's really a classic use of offshore resources, so that's not reinventing the wheel there. Standard walkthroughs, that's going through the system, showing it to the customer. If you have a strong offshore team with good communication skill, they can take on that work also. Same for project management. I think it's great to have US project management, but same thing, having strong offshore team and sending that cost offshore, that can be a great fit because project manager doesn't necessarily have to be available absolutely all the time. Now, things that are more relevant for a onshore resource, a US resource, that would be, I would say, just architecting the solution. You can still do that with offshore resources that are strong. More complex walkthroughs, post-go-live support, just because you need to be available as a consultant, during U.S. business hours if there's some sort of issue that's or emergency that needs a quick fix. And then just figuring out the general data migration strategy. I'd say just customer satisfaction, building that relation with the customer by going on site. That's something that's definitely most effective onshore with a US-based resource. And just helping with the cutover, going on site, and hand-holding for the user acceptance testing. So that's where we see strong value for a US-based onshore resources. But as you can see, there's a lot of tasks that can be shared between the two, and so that's the strength of our model. And I think we'll see that more and more in different services companies. So I'll let with the next poll question.
Thanks so much, Charles. Attendees may respond to this polling question immediately as I read through the question. Here's our third question today. What should the primary factor in choosing an ERP implementation partner? Price, budget, expertise, references, or location? After selecting an answer, please be sure to click the Submit button to ensure that your response is properly recorded. Now, Charles, as I look at this question, I think it's almost like a subjective answer. Each person's going to have their own opinion of what's the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. None of these have, I may have my opinion, but yeah, there's no wrong answers.
So yeah, let's look at those responses and see how they responded.
Expertise. Okay, cool. So, yeah, I'm kind of surprised by references because I do think references are very important because that really gives the reality of how the implementation went with another customer, and you want some feedback on the actual resources, their communication skill, but obviously expertise, that's what you're paying for. Price, budget, yeah, if you're choosing a partner that's very cheap, but then the ERP implementation becomes a nightmare, then what's the point? Because in the end you're going to lose money and you're going to lose time, which eventually is the same thing in the end. And location, well, that's good for the offshore resources. You'll be surprised, actually, a lot of, so we lose sometimes to partners that, on opportunities where they want specifically a local partner. So we totally understand that. I think it's reassuring. It depends on the type of customer, but some customers really want to have that local presence, to know that someone can come by their office very quickly. And in our case, we're still able to, take a plane and go travel to one city or another. But yeah, location does count. But yeah, obviously expertise number one, for sure. Next one, project management. That one is key success factor. And so when we talk about project management, we talk, of course, about project manager. I mean, that's the number one person that's responsible for the project management for the team. What's nice is to have one on the ERP implementation side for the partner, but also to have one to some extent on the customer side, so the company that's purchased the ERP platform, and those two should work together. Usually the partner project manager is the one really creating the project plan, so as you can see, that's one of the key deliverables that he should have from the get-go. So depending on the ERP, you may or may not have a predefined project plan methodology. There is one for NetSuite, for instance, with Suite Success. Communication method style, I think that is very important for a project manager. I've seen projects, for instance, here in Chicago, where the project manager was not a good fit and that they were just removed by the customer twice. So I think customers that have an experience of ERP know that having a good project manager is critical. And if they see one that they don't think is great, then they'll remove them quickly. But just the style of communication, are they clear? Are they in regular contact with you? And then something I read once about project manager, which I thought, which stayed in my mind, is the project manager's role is not to be necessarily liked by the customer, but actually to keep them on track. So it might be annoying because they might push for something or recommend something that's actually not how the customer sees it. But if they're backed up by experience and have some good arguments for that for that decision, then that's actually what they're paid for. That's their expertise as project managers, is to push and to stay on track for that project plan. They definitely are going to define goals, and the best is for them to define realistic goals. So you want to define clear targets. What are we trying to achieve? When are we going to try to achieve it? I think it's good to break up an ERP implementation. As you saw, there's a lot of moving parts, all those different tasks, a lot of different stakeholders. The technical aspect, I'll say the communication, or even you would say political aspect of an ERP implementation, organizational changes. So it's nice to break up all these moving parts into predefined milestones and be able to sign off on a milestone and say, okay, we're done with this phase. Let's move to the next one. We're done with the design. Let's move to testing, for instance. Shared responsibilities, it's the project manager's responsibility to say how we're going to split the different tasks on the project. So, for instance, the partner side will be in charge of developing all the customization, but on the customer side, he'll be in charge of testing all these customizations. So that's the type of task that's very important, is just have clear responsibility defined for each task. If there's just a task sitting there and that's not assigned to anyone, then most likely it will not get done. Go live date, that's a big one, and is defining when you're going to go live and also be realistic about what can be done for the go live date. In terms of risk mitigation for project management, I spoke before about traction, momentum. Those are terms I really like. Is saying, how do you keep that momentum going? How do you keep people focused? Everyone's always pulled by their regular job if they're not fully dedicated to the project, which most likely is the case on for smaller organizations implementing ERP, the director of sales is not going to stop everything to spend 2 months on the CRM implementation, for instance. So you definitely want to keep everyone involved, everyone focused, getting into the system, testing, and that's when it goes back also to having that project sponsor, the leadership that's pulling the project forward or pushing forward. Reporting, you want to have dashboards, KPIs, key performance indicator, showing, okay, how many issues did we have at the beginning of the week? How many do we have now? What I like to do also when you're getting closer to the go live is doing what I call go live countdown, and basically sending an email at the beginning of the week saying, okay, minus 5 weeks to go live. This is what we need to get done this week. At the end of the week, I send out an email saying, okay, this is what we got done this week. This is what's coming up. So just seeing that email with the subject minus 5, minus 4, minus 3 weeks to go live, I think that kind of puts, we'll say, positive pressure on the team to go live, saying that it's coming and to get in the system, make sure, they can't say they didn't know that it was coming. So cost tracking, you want to make sure that you're not exceeding the budget, and that can be driven typically by a change request. But yeah, the time spent on time and material, want to be careful who's spending time on what. Are they entering their time correctly? Am I getting value for the time they're spending? That's especially the case on time and material. You want to document everything. You want to have sign-off from as a partner, you want to have sign-off on, for instance, a functional spec that you delivered for customization. You want to make sure that there's a good audit trail so that if there are some issues down the road that we can go back in history and say, well, look, we agreed on this, you signed off on this, so, that's why it is how it is. So using, tools, we use Basecamp, for instance. I know Jira is widely used, SharePoint. There's a lot of project management tools that can help with that and just, track the different discussions and the sign-off, and, you can even use DocuSign to sign off on certain documents during the course of the project. Escalation, I think that one is tied to the project leadership. For instance, I had a project where they said, well, we're going to try to do everything vanilla, keep it as standard as possible, and so we're going to try to limit customization because there's a risk to any type of customization. So if anyone says, I'm not good with standard and I definitely need a customization, you will go in front of the CEO and defend that, make a case for that customization. So all of a sudden we went from dozens of customizations to hardly anything because no one wanted to go through that exercise. So that's a good way to do it. Escalation also, of course, if something is off with the relationship with the partner or just how the project is going or delays in task getting accomplished. So this is just an example of a project plan. This is the typical one done for NetSuite projects. So this was defined by Oracle. There's 3/3 to this engage phase. That's mainly, okay, we're going to show you as partners, we're going to show you the configuration options for NetSuite, and we're going to advise you on how to set these up based on your industry and best practices. And then step 2, this dry phase, we did the work offline of configuring NetSuite. Now we're going to do these walkthroughs where it's kind of a train the trainer approach and showing you, okay, this is what, for each process area, this is what sales is going to look like, this is what procurement is going to look like, accounting, manufacturing, all those different areas. And you're doing that with what I called earlier the super users. And then this last phase called enable, that's the super users going back to their team and spreading the good word about the ERP, getting people to test, and they are making sure everyone's happy with the system. And so that's why we call it UAT, user acceptance testing. That means they're testing to make sure they accept how it's been configured. And then the last phase is converting, making sure that we send all the legacy data, relevant legacy data, into the new system. And that's so you'd see go live, cut over, all this means the same thing. So next poll.
Yep, here we are for our fourth and final poll question. As with all the other questions, you may begin responding immediately while I read through the question and the response option. What is the best way to mitigate an issue on an ERP project? Escalation, add an additional resource, or meet on site? After selecting your answer, please be sure to click the Submit button to be sure that your answer is properly recorded. So here's another one that'll be interesting, depending on people's experience, Charles, that will have what's the best way to mitigate an issue, as people have had different experiences and they probably have different ways to mitigate those issues.
Absolutely, absolutely. You see the results?
Yeah, let's see those results.
Aha. So this is pretty evenly spread. So escalation, number one. Yeah, absolutely. Add additional resources. So that one's tricky, right? Because let's say the partner is actually pretty mediocre. So if you're adding additional resources from that partner, and if they're not great, then that may be tricky. But it could be a case where the partner is fine, but on the customer side, and we see this a lot with smaller organizations, is everyone is so busy with their regular job that they don't have enough time for the project. So it could be a good case of hiring a contractor or someone new that's not part of the partner implementation team, but that kind of works on the customer side as their internal project manager and helping with that bandwidth issue. So for that case, I definitely agree. But if there's issue with the partner, I would recommend looking at other options. Maybe, I mean, we see ERP implementations where they switch partners because it's not going well. So it's something that's possible, and then you just have to negotiate how to get out of the contract. Meet on site, that's always a good thing, I think, especially if there's been some communication issues, maybe some context that's not understood. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of tied to two. You'd meet on site to escalate and meet on site to decide to add additional resources. Yeah, this is great. The actual delivery. So you want to understand the configuration options of the given platform. You want to make sure, and that's tied to the expertise that we previously discussed for the implementation partner, you want to make sure they actually know the configuration options, because it could be the case if you have a partner that's not super solid that they don't even know how to configure this or that part of the system, or they might not have the expertise for a given module. So you want to make sure you understand the different configuration options and have the expertise to implement them correctly. Training, we talked about that for project management and the different phases. Typically it's done through train the trainer. What's nice, for instance, we record our training sessions for these walkthroughs, train the trainer approach. And so then the customer has those as assets, as videos that he can review. And of course, you're training the team that's there at a given time, but when they're implementing an ERP platform, that's for the long term. So it's nice to have videos that they can look at and show a new resource, for instance, a year later. So I think it's important to ask the implementation partner for that type of asset, or just have documentation in general. So testing. Testing is key. The good one I remember on testing also, I learned that quite early, is that if it's not tested, then it doesn't work. And the other one is hope is not a strategy. So those I all learned from big ERP implementations. So hope is not a strategy is basically don't hope that the customization works. So the developer might be a great developer. He didn't think of everything. There might be some stuff that was lost in translation between the customer had business requirements, the functional consultant wrote some spec, the developer built his development off of that spec. Most likely there's going to be some stuff that was missed. So test. Unit testing is the very basic one. Is the developer, he should be doing unit testing on his side, The functional consultant typically does unit testing also once the customization has been delivered. So that's really at the field level, making sure, okay, this was an integration between this and that system. I'm looking at the mapping, everything is done correctly, I'm running through different cases, all looks good. Integration testing is the next step. That's making sure that when you're looking more at a business flow perspective, with the different steps of a business flow, including these customization, that everything still works together, because the customization might work very well independently, but maybe combined with other objects and other flows, and depending on which order they're created, then it might break. So very important to do the integration testing. And then user acceptance testing, I already talked about. That's the actual business owners testing their solution and saying, okay, we're good with the system, we feel comfortable with going live, and we won't be in panic mode on our first week of go live, after go live. Connectors integrations, for instance, our company has several of these. Typically, you'll find them between the ERP and e-commerce systems, platforms. You can also have connectors to third-party logistics systems. You could have a connector with a CRM, any type of external system. You want to make sure you don't have connectors just to have connectors. So a lot of cases you just want to use what's available in your platform. But yeah, those would be part of a typical delivery. There's always at least one aspect of integration with an external system on larger implementation projects. Risk mitigation. How do I mitigate risk for delivery? The big thing that I've seen over my experience is scope creep. That can be the case. There can be the case where the person that was scoping the project, so in my case, that would be me on this project, I could, miss a requirement, and then it comes up during the implementation. If it's a big thing that I miss, I'd say, okay, well, let's figure something out. But it could also be the typical scope creep would be someone, when he sees the system, it gives them some other ideas about other functionalities. They say, well, actually, why don't we build this, or why don't we build that? And then it just adds up over time. Every new requirement, it becomes a gap, and then has a development cost and has an impact on the go-live date. So that can be an issue. So that's the role of the project manager, also to be realistic about scope creep, and for the customer to push back on requirements that aren't necessarily essential to the go-live. Testing as a training tool, that's, again, UAT, go in the system, test, that's how you're going to learn the system. It's not, you can review the videos, but if you're not in the system testing, then you're probably not going to learn it. Change management, I think that was tied to just the different aspects of the ERP implementation and the impact on the organization, impact on people's work, what's their actual day going to look like now that it's in the new system. And yeah, that's making sure everyone is happy with the new system, or if they're not happy, to see how you can make it easier on them. Is it by changing, their access to the system, giving them more access, or just maybe it is the case for building a new customization to make their life easier. So change management is huge. I mean, there's even companies that just do the change management aspect around big ERP implementation projects. So going live, that is the goal, that is the success. So what's the definition of the go live? The one I give is you went live when your new system, source of truth for financials, typically for ERP, is the new system. So that's the big one, big definition that I give. Data migration, that's the critical part of going live, having that imported correctly in the new system. And then you might have some dependencies for go live, inventory count, if you have inventory, closing month end, these integrations that we talked about. You definitely want to have a contingency plan. I'll give you an example. We were supposed to go live with a customer early November, but they're actually in Sonoma, so they were surrounded by fires. So when you're talking to the CEO and he's installing a generator at home to save his fridge, and you're telling him about go live, then he has other priorities. He's wearing a air mask. So you definitely want to have a plan B for the project. And that can also be people that are not available at the last minute. Make sure you have a backup consultant, a backup business owner, and then, think about how that impacts the go live and when it can be rescheduled. Tools, on-site presence, as we said, that's a good time to be on-site is during that cutover, and you definitely want post-go live support. We typically offer 1 month of post-go live support for our NetSuite implementations, and we find that adequate, but you can always have, premium support with Oracle, for instance, or just an ongoing engagement on time and material or team-based. So yeah, you just want to think about, what do things look like once I'm live. So the last final point that I wanted to make was on next steps. As you can see, there's a lot of work in going live with the ERP project, ERP implementation. But the nice thing is once it is actually in place and there's a system that the company can scale with, maybe they were stuck with a legacy system that was a pain to use. And I think the really cool part, and that's, I would say, my favorite part, is when actually it is live, then to think about what you can build on that platform. For instance, I have customers say, well, now we're on NetSuite, we need, business-to-business mobile app, or we want to do e-commerce. We've never done e-commerce. Can we implement an e-commerce site? So that's what I really like. I had a customer, it's called the Renewal Workshop this summer. That was a classic request for information with an RFQ, a document of requirements that was done. And, we went there, we scoped it out, went on site, saw what they were doing, and a whole renewal process, circular economy with renewing the North Face close. And that was something that was not standard for NetSuite. So we built a whole architecture of customization on top of standard NetSuite to build that, and they just went live. So that's what I really love, is to see something that was just an idea and then it's actually delivered and you see it in action. And I'm looking forward to going back there on site and seeing their teams actually using the tool and all these customizations that were just PowerPoint slides at first. So yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Charles. We'd like to begin addressing some of the questions for our audience members. Let me first remind our participants to send us your questions and comments by typing it into the Q&A panel on the left side of your screen. So here's a good question, Charles. There have been a number of questions about, different issues that would possibly cause scope creep into a project. In your experience, what integration issues have you observed as most frequently leading to an implementation to jump off tracks?
I think the big one is the customer being a communication gap during the earlier phase of the implementation, where someone forgot to mention an external system that was actually critical to the overall architecture. So I think that's one. And then it could also be someone saying, well, I really, really like, let's say you're on NetSuite and say, but I really, really like Salesforce. And they say, well, I want to purchase Salesforce and then connect it to NetSuite. So it's a mix of things that were missed and then things that are just kind of maybe a nice to have, but that someone is really pushing for.
So are there any other recommendations that you would have? Because obviously that would lead to a difficult ERP implementation. Are there other examples of that? And what would you have done differently? What advice would you give for people going into that?
I think a great tool is doing architecture document of kind of like a landscape of all the systems that talk together when you arrive to a new customer for ERP implementation, so that you understand all the systems and the flows and the different documents that flow between those different systems. So that's for the, risk mitigation for the missing something part, and then the risk mitigation for, if someone on the customer side, and as the VP of sales says, no, we absolutely need Salesforce, it's going to be difficult to push back. But then as a consultant, the project manager needs to say, well, there's going to be an impact on the go live date, and there's going to be a cost associated to it. So I think it's just, sharing that information and being realistic and not over-promising.
Yeah, that's great. So when you're implementing any system, a lot of times there's the urge to maybe customize your solution or do something very special or specific to your organization. There's been a number of questions around, wouldn't it be better to not customize a solution because doesn't that make services and updates difficult? Or should what are your thoughts on customization of a solution?
Absolutely. So it's kind of tricky, right? Because as an implementation partner, you could actually say, well, customizations are great because that's more hours for us, that's more money. But I think it's also a question of credibility. Is you want to do, our philosophy is do customization where there's a clear ROI and you're sure that there's nothing standard that can replace it. I think with modern ERP, customizations are built in a way where it doesn't disrupt a version upgrade. Typically with NetSuite, for instance, there's a layer of customization that's done on top of standard NetSuite, so that when there's a version upgrade, it gives you a release preview, for instance, where you can test your customization. But I've never seen the case where the upgrade messed up the customization. Now with systems like SAP, a version upgrade, especially with customers that have been on SAP for a while, that could be a project, of a dozen consultants for 6 months. I mean, just, a crazy amount of expenses to cover that version upgrade. But yeah, absolutely, I would stick to standard if possible, as much as possible, and then just discuss the ROI for customization if it's really needed.
Well, that's great advice. Is there a good rule of thumb for estimating your implementation costs?
Yes, what I see, well, that's on NetSuite, but what I see is usually a ratio between the software implementation and the software cost for the first year and the implementation cost. We usually land at a 1.5, so implementation is 1.5 times the software cost for the first year. But again, we have different parameters, say how many onshore hours do you want, how many offshore hours do you want, and we can play on those levers to get to a more competitive budget or a budget that has more onshore hours, depending on what the customer is looking for.
That's great. And then as a final question, how do you get your process owners to buy into a new ERP and get them engaged to a certain extent?
Honestly, the ones that move quick, especially in the NetSuite space where it's small and medium businesses, is there's some kind of critical event that happened or it's just too painful to use the legacy system. The big one we're seeing right now is around security with ransomware. Systems that are on-premise have could be the case of ransomware where it locks them out of their system. As you can imagine, that's a huge cost in terms of lost time, in terms of lost deals, in terms of, credibility. So it could also be something technical around, for instance, the on-premise system where they have to replace the server, so there's a huge cost there. So yeah, I would say kind of like a critical event, especially for those type of companies. And larger corporate, I think that's kind of more strategic direction, saying, okay, this system is too costly now. We just have to move on to a more modern platform.
Well, we appreciate your insight, Charles, and I'm going to turn things back over to Margaret.
Thank you, Adam. At this time, I'd like to thank our presenter, Charles Thevenet, for sharing his knowledge and expertise with us. We're very appreciative that he's made time for IMA and for our audience today. And also, thank you, Adam Larson, for moderating today's event. As a last step, please be sure to complete the event evaluation survey, which should be visible on your screen. If it has not popped open, please click the evaluation survey icon at the bottom of your screen for access. After completing the survey, if you have met the requirements for CPE credit, you will be able to access your certificate of completion today using one of two methods. First, you may click the CPE icon at the bottom of your console before the webinar concludes. You may also click the CPE credit link on the right side of your post-event thank you email that you will receive later today. Please save or print a copy of the certificate for your records. And finally, your CPE credit will be automatically entered into your member transcript. Listen to Count Me In, IMA's podcast about all things affecting the accounting and finance world. Tune in to hear the latest perspectives and learnings from the experts and thought leaders shaping the profession. Find it and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. I want to again thank Oracle NetSuite for sponsoring today's webinar and thank all of you for your participation in today's event, your commitment to IMA, and your professional development through IMA's Inside Talk webinar series. I look forward to spending time with you again soon when we'll enjoy some more Inside Talk.